It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just another day in court, but as she sat there, hands trembling, heart pounding, she knew this was anything but ordinary. "How do you plead?" The judge's voice cut through the suffocating silence. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "How do you defend yourself against a crime you didn't commit? How do you fight when the system is already against you?" The whispers in the courtroom were deafening. The prosecutor smirked. The jury avoided her gaze. She could already see it. The verdict, the punishment, the life stolen from her before her very eyes. But then, the doors swung open. A hushed gasp spread like wildfire. A courtroom officer rushed to the judge, whispering something that made his expression shift from certainty to shock. A phone call had just come in. From the White House. Just weeks ago, Emily Carter was living an ordinary life. A school teacher, a friend, a daughter. Nothing about her suggested she would ever stand trial for a crime. Mornings smelled like fresh coffee and chalk dust. Evenings were spent grading papers, curled up on her worn-out couch. It was a simple, predictable life, until it all shattered in an instant. The police came at dawn. Flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of her small apartment. Their fists pounded on the door, voices barking orders. Confused and half asleep, she barely had time to react before cold steel handcuffs clamped around her wrists. "You're under arrest." The words didn't make sense. For what? She was accused of embezzlement, stealing thousands from a school fund she barely had access to. It was absurd. But no one cared about her denial. The headlines called her a fraud. The parents demanded justice. And now, in this cold courtroom, with accusing eyes locked onto her, the weight of an entire system pressed down on her chest. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting against a world that had already decided she was guilty. Emily clung to the belief that the truth would save her. "There's been a mistake," she told the officers. "Check the records. I didn't take any money." But they barely looked at her. "Tell it to the judge." Her lawyer wasn't much better, a court-appointed attorney who shuffled papers more than he asked questions. "We'll try to negotiate a plea deal," he said flatly. A plea deal? Why would she admit to something she hadn't done? She begged them to investigate. The school's financial records were a mess, numbers altered, signatures forged. Someone had framed her. But when her lawyer brought it up in court, the prosecution scoffed. "Conspiracy theories won't save your client, counselor." Each day felt heavier than the last. The prosecution paraded witnesses, a co-worker who always found her suspicious, a parent who had a bad feeling about her. None of it was proof, but it didn't matter. Emily sat in her holding cell at night, staring at the cracked ceiling. How did this happen? How do you fight when no one listens? Her last hope was a reporter who seemed interested in her case. He promised to look into the evidence. But the next day, his article never appeared. His emails stopped. And when she tried to call, disconnected. Someone didn't want the truth to come out. As she walked into court that morning, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. Someone powerful wanted her silenced, and they were winning. Emily sat motionless as the prosecutor delivered his final argument. "The evidence is undeniable," he declared, his voice dripping with certainty. "Emily Carter stole from the very children she was meant to protect. She must be held accountable." The jury's faces were unreadable. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to issue a ruling. Emily gripped the wooden table, bracing for the inevitable. Then, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A uniformed officer rushed in, whispering something to the judge. His eyes flickered with something Emily hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. Confusion spread across the courtroom like wildfire. The judge held up a hand, silencing the murmurs. "A phone call has just come in?" His voice wavered slightly. "From the White House." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor's smug expression crumbled. Emily's heart pounded. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading from a hastily passed note. There is new evidence. A federal investigation has been launched into this case and into multiple individuals involved in the prosecution. Silence. Heavy. Electric. The prosecutor stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. This is ridiculous. What new evidence? This is a local matter. The judge's gavel slammed down. Not anymore. Emily inhaled sharply. Someone out there believed her, someone powerful, and just like that, the ground beneath her case began to shift. The courtroom was no longer the prosecutor's stage. It was a battlefield he was losing. Federal investigators arrived within hours, unsealing documents that had been buried for years. The missing funds? Redirected through a complex web of accounts tied to powerful figures within the district. Emily wasn't a criminal. She was the scapegoat. Days later, the charges against her were dropped. She walked out of the courthouse to a sea of cameras, her face no longer one of fear, but of quiet strength. Reporters now wanted the truth. Parents, once convinced of her guilt, held signs demanding justice, not for just Emily, but for all the cases like hers that never got this far. The prosecutor resigned in disgrace. The corrupt officials who orchestrated the scheme faced their own trials. But for Emily, the victory wasn't just personal. It was a wake-up call. She took her fight beyond that courtroom. She spoke at rallies, worked with investigative journalists, and became a voice for the falsely accused. Her case exposed cracks in a system designed to protect the powerful and silence the innocent. And though her name was finally cleared, she knew one thing for certain. There were still countless others trapped in the same nightmare she had barely escaped. With the world watching, she vowed, never again. Emily's story wasn't just about one woman. It was about a broken system, a fight for truth, and the power of refusing to stay silent. How many others have been swallowed by injustice, their voices unheard, their lives destroyed? Her case sparked a national conversation. New policies were introduced to prevent wrongful accusations, and investigative journalism became a weapon against corruption. But the fight is far from over. Injustice thrives in silence. If her story proves anything, it's this. Truth doesn't always win on its own. It needs people willing to stand for it. So, the next time you hear a story that doesn't sit right, ask questions. Demand answers. Speak up. Because as Emily once said, standing before a crowd that now cheered her name, injustice survives when good people look away. But justice begins the moment we refuse to.